division, that was bulbus cordis, ventricle proper, atrium proper, sinus venosus. Later on, the bulbus cordis is divided into two: the truncus arteriosus, the conus cordis, the ventricle proper, the atrium proper. And I told you this is the distal end of the heart tube, and this is the, suppose this is the proximal end, and this one is the arterial end, and this one is the venous end. And I also told you the distal dilatation. Distally, the two heart tube do not fuse entirely, and the fusion is incomplete here. And I told you, so the sinus venosus is a central part here, and two horn we call the right horn of sinus venosus and the left horn of sinus venosus. And I also told you that this is the venous end and this is the arterial end. And I also told you that the venous end receive three paired veins, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. And from medial to lateral, they are the vitelline vein, the umbilical vein, and the cardinal vein. And I also told you that the vitelline vein drain the yolk sac. And I am repeatedly telling you that the yolk sac will be incorporated into the embryo during folding of the embryo and will become the digestive tube. So the vitelline vein drains the yolk sac, that means the digestive tube later on. And I also told you that umbilical vein, there are two paired umbilical vein, right and left. The umbilical vein, the vitelline vein, as the name implies, they carry deoxygenated blood from the yolk sac. The umbilical vein, on the other hand, though they are vein, but they carry highly oxygenated blood from the primordial placenta, the right umbilical vein and the left umbilical vein. And I also told you that the right umbilical vein disappears during the 7th week. The right umbilical vein disappears during the 7th week. Only the left umbilical vein remain, and this is the left umbilical vein is the only source of blood, oxygenated blood from the primordial placenta. And I also told you that this left umbilical vein, later on, after full development from the embryonic period to the fetal period, then the birth of the baby, when the baby will be born, the left umbilical vein, because there is no placenta at that time, the baby will come out and you cut the umbilical cord. So the left umbilical vein will become the ligamentum teres hepatis, which you have already know from your liver, from your viscera liver, because you have seen in the figure, we are unable to show you the real viscera from the body, but I think you have seen the figure. The left umbilical vein will become the ligamentum teres hepatis. So this much we said, and also I told you that there are two cardinal veins. They also carry deoxygenated blood from the body of the embryo. And I also told you that this is the central part of the sinus venosus. This is the atrium proper. And here there will be an opening, what we call the sinuatrial orifice. Orifice means big opening. Sinuatrial orifice, which will communicate to this orifice. Thus, the central part of the sinus venosus will communicate with the atrium proper. And here, as this is the ventricle proper, atrium proper, there is another opening from atrium to ventricle, or from ventricle to atrium. We call it atrioventricular canal. And I also told you that the bulbus cordis will be divided into two, the distal end and the proximal end. Why? You can ask me, madam, why this is distal, this is proximal, in relation to the main part. ventricle proper and atrium proper. So this is the proximal end, this is the distal end. The distal end is known as the truncus arteriosus, and the proximal dilatation is known as the conus cordis. So bulbus cordis will become conus cordis and the truncus arteriosus, I told in my last lecture. And I'm again telling that this is the arterial end and this is the venous end. This is a heart tube. Okay. And I told you that this truncus arteriosus will divide like this. If we think very simply, আমরা যদি এখানে একটা partition দিয়ে দিই, if we draw a line here, then this part will become the pulmonary trunk and this part will become the aorta. তার মানে truncus arteriosus will give rise to pulmonary trunk and our aorta. So what will happen to this conus, this dilatations? This will also divide into two if we draw a line here. So this part and this part. So the part in relation with the truncus arteriosus will become the infundibulum. If you remember about your heart viscera, or if you remember about your figure, this is the infundibulum, that is the outflow part of the pulmonary trunk. And this part in relation to the aorta will become the aortic vestibule. They both come from conus cordis. So this much we have told, and today I will discuss about the arterial end, about not in very much detail, but something about this arterial end. So I will talk about the arterial end of the single heart tube. Now we will talk about the aortic arches and other part of dorsal aorta. Just follow me and see the figure. So as the pharyngeal arches form during 4th and 5th week, you know about the pharyngeal arches because we have finished those arches, pouches and cleft. And we have seen many structures of our head neck region come from these pharyngeal arches, if you just think or if you recapitulate. So when these pharyngeal arches are developing during the 4th and 5th week, they should be supplied by arteries, because without arteries or blood, they will not survive. Now, these arches will be supplied by arteries. We call them aortic arches. So pharyngeal arches are supplied by aortic arches. And these aortic arches come from aortic sac, and these arches terminate in the dorsal aorta. Let us see figure will come here. So here we are showing the heart tube, single heart tube, but this is bended. Heart tube ta erokom chilo lomba, kintu it has been bended. This is the venous end, this is the arterial end. So this venous arterial end will give rise to aortic arches. 1, 2, 3. So pharyngeal arch will develop during 4th and 5th week here. And these the derivatives of the pharyngeal arches will be supplied by aortic arches. Ekta, duita, tinta. So these aortic arches will come from aortic sac. This is the aortic sac coming from the arterial end of the heart tube. This is the aortic sac. And these aortic arches will be drained into the dorsal aorta. This one, the red one, the whole thing is the dorsal aorta, purata, dorsal aorta. So what are we saying? We are saying that when the pharyngeal arches are developing, the structures derived from the pharyngeal arches will be supplied by aortic arches. So from where they come? They come from aortic sac. Aortic sac come from the arterial end of the heart tube. And these then will drain into the dorsal aorta. Initially there were 2 dorsal aorta, and then they will fuse to form a single aorta. প্রথমে এদিকে একটা, and over the other end there is another. Ultimately, the dorsal aorta will fuse to form a single aorta. So this is what I was telling, though the language is a bit different. So when the pharyngeal arches form during fourth and fifth weeks, the pharyngeal arches derivatives are supplied by some arteries known as the aortic arches. And these aortic arches arise from aortic sac, and these aortic arches terminate in the dorsal aorta. So here in enlarged view, this is a single heart tube, but bended here because the heart tube becomes so large that our pericardial cavity cannot give it space, so it bends. And the arterial end, the venous end, and the atrium go on the back of the heart, and the ventricle lie here and the arterial lie on the front. That is why the base of the heart is formed by the atrium, because বেসটা কোনটা পিছনের দিকে on the dorsal aspect. And these are the aortic arches, একটা দুটা তিনটা, and they come from aortic sac here and they drain into the dorsal aorta. So there are initially a paired dorsal aorta run through the entire length of the embryo, but soon they fuse to form a single dorsal aorta just caudal to the pharyngeal arches. So there are two dorsal aortae. Later on, they fuse to form a single dorsal aorta, which lie caudal to the pharyngeal arches. So there is a single dorsal aorta. And there will be 30 or so branches of dorsal aorta, which we call dorsal intersegmental arteries, pass between and carry blood to the somites and their derivatives. So if you think about the somites are so important. They come from mesoderm and they are divided into three parts from medial to lateral: sclerotome, myotome, dermatome. Sclerotome gives rise to vertebral column. Myotome gives rise to skeletal muscles. Dermatome gives rise to dermis. So when you talk about our myotome, that is the skeletal muscles, they need to have everything. They need to have their blood supply. So the somites, derivatives of the somites get their blood supply from the dorsal intersegmental artery, which arise from the dorsal aorta. I will show you figure. So this is the dorsal aorta, eta. And these all small arteries, look here, 1, 2, 3, 4, and so many. So 30 or more dorsal intersegmental arteries. They supply the whole embryo, the somites and their derivatives and everything else. So the intersegmental arteries. So there are 30 or more than that. There are intersegmental arteries which arise from the dorsal aorta and they supply the somites and their derivatives. The dorsal intersegmental arteries in the neck region join to form the vertebral arteries. You have read about the vertebral arteries and you have seen there are two vertebral arteries which stay or reside within the কোথায় থাকে কি আছে? There is the foramina transversarium on the transverse process of the cervical vertebra, and the vertebral arteries দুইটা থাকে দুই পাশে, two on each side of our neck, and they run and they reside inside the foramina transversarium. So from where they come from the dorsal intersegmental arteries in the neck region. Suppose here, এখানে যদি dorsal intersegmental artery, they unite to form the vertebral arteries. So you know about the vertebral arteries. In the thorax, the dorsal intersegmental arteries form intercostal arteries. So there are how many intercostal arteries? In each space, there are 3 intercostal arteries. Dorsal, 1 dorsal intercostal artery and 2 anterior intercostal arteries. 1 posterior or dorsal and 2 anterior. So in each intercostal space, you have forgotten, I think, but try to remember or recapitulate. একটা intercostal space তিনটা, 3 intercostal arteries থাকবে. 1 posterior intercostal artery, 2 anterior intercostal arteries. So they supply the region over there and they come from dorsal intersegmental artery in the region of the thorax. And in the abdomen, they form lumbar arteries. There are 2 lumbar arteries in the abdomen. So in the abdomen, most of the dorsal intersegmental arteries become lumbar arteries. But the 5th pair of the lumbar arteries, there are 5 pairs of lumbar arteries, which pass through the ventral sacral foramina, if you remember. So in the abdomen, most of the dorsal intersegmental arteries become lumbar arteries. But the 5th pair of lumbar intersegmental arteries remain as the common iliac arteries. If you remember about the common iliac artery. In adult, what happens, I'm just talking this so that you can recapitulate your gross anatomy. আমি কিন্তু gross anatomy টা যাতে help হয় সেজন্য এগুলো বলে যাচ্ছি. In embryology, maybe আমরা এত জিজ্ঞেস করব না যে কোন intersegmental artery থেকে কি আসছে, but I'm talking this because of so that you remember about you just can recollect the previous studies, like the lumbar arteries, like the common iliac arteries. So common iliac arteries, there are 2, if you remember. দুইটা common iliac artery আছে. The aorta divides at the region of 4th lumbar vertebra to form 2 common iliac arteries, right? If you remember. মনে রাখতে হবে. And in the sacral region, the intersegmental arteries form lateral sacral arteries. So there are 2 lateral sacral arteries and they run on each side of the ventral sacral foramina. যদি মনে থাকে, দুইটা lateral sacral artery থাকে দুই পাশ দিয়ে, the ventral sacral foramina দুই পাশ দিয়ে run করে, and they come from the intersegmental arteries in the sacral region. So we just jump, and at the caudal end, the dorsal aorta become the median sacral artery. এখন we will ask you in the exam from your gross anatomy, what are the branches of the aorta in adult? জিজ্ঞেস করব. তাহলে median sacral artery একটা branch, definitely, and this is the ventral branch of the aorta. It is a single branch. It is a single branch where the aorta divides into 2 common iliac artery. ঠিক ওই জায়গাটা থেকে median sacral artery will come out. So we will ask you. And so we have finished about this. Just একটুখানি আমি grossটা, I just wanted to help you to remember your previous studies about the median sacral arteries, about the lateral sacral arteries, of the common iliac arteries. Now about the vitelline arteries. So the vitelline arteries, so don't confuse with the veins and the arteries. Vitelline vein or vitelline arteries সাথে কোনো confusion নাই. Vitelline arteries are unpaired. I just talked about the intersegmental artery, বলেছি 30 or more. Okay. Now I'm talking about the ventral branches, and I'm talking about the arteries, ventral branches of the aorta, dorsal aorta. So they are vitelline arteries, and so on. I'll talk. Vitelline arteries are unpaired. They pass to the yolk sac and later the primordial gut. Let us see the figure. So this one is the vitelline artery. They are the ventral branches of the dorsal aorta. The dorsal branches of the dorsal aorta are the intersegmental artery. Again, I'm repeating. This is the dorsal aorta, and initially it was 2, and then it fused to form a single aorta. ঠিক আছে? So dorsal branches are intersegmental artery, একটা, দুইটা, তিনটা, 1, 2, 3, 4, so 30 or more. And I have told that in the neck region, what they form, in the thoracic region, what they form, in the lumbar region, what they form, in the sacral region, what they form, okay? Now I'm talking about the ventral branches of this dorsal aorta. So I'm talking about the vitelline artery, and this one is the vitelline artery. Vitelline artery is unpaired, and they drain the yolk sac. That is the primordial gut. Yolk sac will be incorporated to form the primordial gut. So vitelline artery drain the yolk vein, drain the yolk sac. Vitelline artery supply the yolk sac. That means the primordial gut. Now, three vitelline arteries. There are so many vitelline arteries in figure. I couldn't show you. আমি ওরকম ফিগারটা পাই নাই. So there are so many vitelline arteries. There are so many ventral branches or so many vitelline arteries. Sorry, there are so many vitelline artery কয়েকটাই থাকবে, but only three will remain. I have shown here one, ওইটা আমি পারি নাই দেখাতে. So vitelline arteries, they are unpaired. They are They are unpaired, and they pass to the yolk sac and later the primordial gut. Look at the vitelline artery. So three vitelline arteries remain. অনেকগুলাই ছিল, but only three will persist. Kiki, celiac trunk to the foregut, superior mesenteric artery to midgut, inferior mesenteric artery to hindgut. This is very important. We will ask you that what are the ventral branches of our aorta? The answer should be from above downwards, madam, celiac trunk, superior mesenteric artery and inferior mesenteric artery. এই অ্যান্সারটাই হবে। তো জিজ্ঞেস করব এই যে celiac trunk, superior mesenteric artery, from where they come? Madam, they are the branches of the dorsal aorta and they are the vitelline arteries. That means they supply the yolk sac, and we know the yolk sac will become our gut tube. So they will supply our gut. So তিনটা vitelline artery থাকবে. From above downwards, they are celiac trunk, superior mesenteric artery, and inferior mesenteric artery. And you know, আমরা আবার এটাও জিজ্ঞেস করব, celiac trunk will supply whom? Madam, celiac trunk will supply the foregut. Superior mesenteric artery will supply whom? The midgut. Inferior mesenteric artery supply whom? The hindgut. This should be the answer. So this is about the three vitelline arteries. এবং তিনটা vitelline artery will remain কি উপর থেকে নিচে, celiac trunk, superior mesenteric artery and inferior mesenteric artery. Clear? এটা মনে থাকে জানো. Now about the umbilical arteries. Umbilical arteries are paired. They pass through connecting stalk. Later, the connecting stalk will become umbilical cord, you know, and to the placenta, and they carry poorly oxygenated blood. So this is the exception. We will ask you that vein always carry deoxygenated blood, but in some region of our body, vein carry oxygenated blood. What are those? Answer ta hobe 4 pulmonary veins carry oxygenated blood from our lung to the left atrium of the heart. Ekta. Arekta ki? The other one, during the fetal life or embryonic life or fetal life, the left umbilical vein and initially the right umbilical vein, they carry highly oxygenated blood from the placenta to the embryo and the fetus. Tahole eta holo. Now, about the arteries carry oxygenated blood, but there are exceptions like the umbilical arteries. The right and left umbilical artery, though they are artery, but they carry poorly oxygenated blood, or you can say deoxygenated. Nowadays, we don't say deoxygenated, আমরা বলি poorly oxygenated blood. একেবারে deoxygenated না, poorly oxygenated. So umbilical arteries, এটা pair থাকবে right and left, and they carry and they carry poorly oxygenated blood from the embryo and the fetus to the placenta. তারপরে then they will go to the mother, ওখানে আবার purification, they come back to the through the umbilical vein and will come here. Okay, so this is the about the umbilical arteries. They pass to the connecting stalk. So what about the connecting stalk? Connecting barbar bolchi. This is the connecting stalk where there is extra embryonic mesoderm. Connecting stalk এর মধ্যে আছে extra embryonic mesoderm. And this connecting stalk will later become the umbilical cord. And as this is extra embryonic mesoderm, আমরা কি করি? কেটে ফেলি. When the baby is born, we cut it here and clamp. So if it is extra embryonic mesoderm, if it were intraembryonic mesoderm, and if we have cut it down here, তাহলে তো হতো না. Fetus will have been hampered. That is why, remember, this is extra embryonic mesoderm. And the umbilical arteries and vein pass through here. The umbilical arteries are two, and they carry poorly oxygenated blood from the embryo and the fetus to the placenta and then to the mother. তাহলে হয়ে গেল বাস, no more from here. And এটা এখন আর আমি পড়াবো না. And okay, so this is about fetal circulation. I'll talk about this later on. এখন আর fetal circulation বলবো না, now, not now. Now again, the primordial heart is first evident at 18 days. Because the 18 days means starting of end of how many what week? Second or starting of third week. The cardiogenic areas blanking again. I'm not going to that. And this is, I have already told you about this and this fusion. এটা এখন বলছি না. Another lecture. Again, I'm telling about the tubular dilatations because it comes in the exam. So the tubular heart elongates and develops alternate dilatations and constrictions. Right, you can write it down, or already if you have written it down, from superior to inferior, from cranial to caudal, truncus arteriosus. This should be conus caudis, the ventricle proper, the atrium proper, and so there can be a question in the SAQ, enumerate the dilatations of the heart tube. So initially you write there are 4 dilatations, the bulbus caudis, and then this, and then there will be the bulbus caudis will be divided into truncus arteriosus and conus caudis. Or if you write this one, truncus arteriosus, conus caudis, instead of bulbus caudis, you write conus caudis, ventricle, atrium proper, sinus venosus. And about the sinus venosus, I have already told you. And this is a view of heart in 24 days, showing blood flow through it. Because I told you during 22 to 23 days, blood flow starts to give nutrition to the fetus. And this is the heart. This is a sagittal section of the primordial heart, 24 days, showing blood flow through it. Look at the arrow. These two are the sinus venosus, and this is the sinuatrial valve. This is the primordial atrium. This will form the atrioventricular valve here. The blood not yet formed. Now this blood is coming to the ventricle, primordial ventricle, then through the conus caudis to the truncus arteriosus, and then to the aortic sac, and then the aortic arches. So this is how blood supply occurs in third week or fourth week, like this. এভাবে, from the sinus venosus to the sinuatrial orifice into the atrium proper, to the primordial atrioventricular canal, to the ventricle proper, from the ventricle proper to the bulbus cordis. Later on, it will form the conus cordis, then the truncus arteriosus, and then the aortic sac, and then the aortic arches. And we have already told you about the sinus venosus. Now, the arterial and venous ends of the heart are fixed by the pharyngeal arches and the septum transversum rectum. Now they're telling that this arterial, this end and this end of the heart are fixed. This end is fixed by the aortic arches, and this end, this venous end, is fixed by the septum transversum, because septum transversum will lie here. Look at the arrow, arrowটা দেখো, এখানে septum transversum. Septum transversum will lie here. So this arterial end and the venous end of the heart tube are fixed. দড়ি দিয়ে, যেরকম এটা aortic arches দিয়ে, and this is through the septum transversum. The arterial and venous ends of the heart tubes are fixed by the pharyngeal arches and the septum transversum, respectively. Venous end is fixed by the septum transversum, caudally. Septum transversum. And because the bulbus cordis and ventricle grows faster than other regions, the heart bends upon itself, forming a U-shaped bulboventricular loop. So why the heart tube bends? The heart tube bends, there are two things. One is the heart tube bends rapidly, and the pericardial cavity cannot give it space, one thing. And the other thing is the ventricle proper and the bulbus cordis grow faster than other regions like the atrium or the venous end. So the heart tube bends upon itself, forming a U-shaped loop, which is known as the bulboventricular loop. Dekhi? So this is the arterial end, this is the venous end. The pericardial cavity is not big enough to give space to the whole heart tube to enlarge like this, এরকম করে. And also, and also the bulbus, this region, that is the arterial and that is the bulbus cordis, and the ventricle grows faster than other regions like the atrium and the sinus venosa. So there, the heart tube bends, and this bending is known as the bulboventricular loop. So if you remember in gross anatomy, your heart, যদি হার্টটা আমরা মনে করি, so আমরা দেখি যে ventricle আর arterial end lie in front, ventricleটা সামনে আর নিচে, আর the atrium and the venous end is on the back of the heart. So if you understand the development, you can remember the gross anatomy. Eta bhul hobe na. So this is the bulboventricular loop. As the primordial heart tube bends, the atrium and the sinus venosus come to lie dorsal to the truncus arteriosus, bulbus cordis, and the ventricle. This is the main thing. This is the main thing. মনে রাখার জন্য যে the heart tube cannot grow longer, খালি বড়ই হতে থাকবে in this pericardial cavity, একটা কথা. আর second, the heart tube, the bulbus cordis and the ventricle grow faster than other parts. So it bends upon itself, forming an U-shaped loop, which is known as bulboventricular loop. And as a result, what we can see the atrium and sinus venosus come to lie dorsal to the truncus arteriosus, bulbus cordis, and ventricle. তার মানে কি? আমরা দেখতে পাচ্ছি atrium and sinus venosus come to lie on the dorsal aspect of the ventricle, bulbus cordis, and truncus arteriosus. তো আমরা এগুলাকে পিছিয়ে পাচ্ছি. So how the base of the heart is formed? জিজ্ঞেস করব, madam, by the two atria, mainly 2/3 by the left atrium, 1/3 by the right atrium. এটা আর ভুল হবে না. So this is about the gross anatomy. দরকার নাই এখন। As the heart elongates and bends, it gradually invaginates into the pericardial cavity. So you know the word invagination. Invagination মানে হচ্ছে to go inside or deep inside into a cavity. Deep, একটা কিছুর ভিতরে ঢুকে যাওয়া. To deep inside a cavity. So when the heart elongates and bends, it gradually invaginates into the pericardial cavity from above. উপর থেকে নিচে, because we have seen due to cranial folding, the pericardial cavity come to lie at the caudal region of the heart tube. মনে আছে কিনা? হ্যাঁ, এটা নিচে নেমে আসে. So look at this figure. There is folding of the embryo, cranial folding. Look at the arrow, cranial folding. So cranial folding এর জন্য what is happening? এটা যেটা ছিল উপরে আর heart tube ছিল নিচে, they come to lie on the ventral aspect of the heart, and the pericardial cavity come to lie on the caudal region. এখানে নিচের দিকে, below. And the septum transversum lie here. This is septum transversum. So look, the heart tube is bending and invaginating into the pericardial cavity. So এটা থেকে আমরা কি বুঝতে পারি? So pericardial cavity টা হলো দুটো জিনিস. This layer of the pericardium তো দুইটা layer আছে. that will become the visceral layer. And this layer will become the parietal layer. And this is our pericardial space or cavity. If you remember, এত বড় cavity তো আর নাই. There was a big cavity, না, একটা বেলুনের মতো. When this heart tube invaginates into it from above, কি হবে? This cavity will become potential space. এটা ছোট হয়ে যাবে. It will become narrow space. And this two layer of the pericardial cavity, one which covered the viscera, that is the heart tube, will become the visceral layer or of the pericardial cavity, and the other বাইরে যেটা আছে, that is the parietal layer. Inside is the pericardial cavity. So remember it. And in case of heart, there is another layer, বাইরে আরেকটা layer থাকে, that is the fibrous pericardium, that comes from pleuropericardial fold, if you remember, বাইরের দিকে আরেকটা. So the heart is, so this is important, invagination. And in anatomy, remember, always see figures, pictures. Practical is so important here. And unfortunately, we are unable to show you the viscera, the body and everything because of this pandemic situation. But you can see your figures from different books. And 40% of your study will be completed if you see only figures and then your text. So figures, pictures, illustrations are very important in anatomy. So this is about, now the heart is initially suspended from the dorsal wall of the embryo by mesentery, the dorsal mesocardium. প্রথম দিকে এটা একটা dorsal mesocardium, this is the dorsal body wall, suppose, আর হার্টটা suspended আছে by a dorsal, by mesentery, we call it dorsal mesocardium. এটা দরকার নাই. Now this is the, আচ্ছা এটা, হ্যাঁ এখানে হ্যাঁ. So this can be the dorsal mesocardium, এটা. And then here there will be a cavity, a dorsal mesocardium মধ্যে, and this cavity is nothing but the transverse pericardial sinus. So I'm showing you another figure. আরেকটা দেখাই. The heart is initially suspended from the dorsal wall by mesentery. We call it dorsal mesocardium. The central part of the dorsal mesocardium soon degenerates, forming a communication, the transverse pericardial sinus, between the right and left sides of the pericardial cavity. তাহলে এটা দেখি আমরা, হ্যাঁ, এটা this picture. So over there is the right side, এদিকে হচ্ছে left side. So the heart tube is suspended from the dorsal body wall by dorsal mesocardium. এটা. And soon the central part of the dorsal mesocardium will die, that is degenerate, forming a communication between the right and left side of the heart. মানে ওই দিক থেকে এদিক, look at the arrow. And this is between the arterial and venous end of the heart tube. So in reality, when you hold a viscer, আমরা দেখাতে বলি যে দেখাও তো, show me where is the transverse pericardial sinus. So between the arterial end and the venous end, একটা আঙ্গুল দিতে হয়. So this is the transverse pericardial sinus. So we have finished it. Now, circulation through primordial heart, the initial contraction of heart originate in muscle. They are myogenic. So look, the muscles, they are excitable tissue. They can contract and relax. The neurons are excitable tissue. They can pass impulse. They are excitable tissue. Muscles are excitable tissue. In case of heart, they are cardiac muscle. They are also excitable, but they have conducting system within them. যেমন SA node, AV node, তারপরে AV bundle. These are the conducting tissues. But initially, they were not present there. তাহলে from where this contraction happened? কোত্থেকে হবে? So the initial contraction of the heart is myogenic. Muscle নিজে নিজেই contract করে. So this is myogenic. They are of myogenic. The muscle itself contract and relax. So this is the way sagittal section at 4th week. Muscle, it's like peristalsis from here to here, from here to here. এখান থেকে এখানে. The muscle layer of atrium and ventricle are continuous and contraction occur in peristaltic-like waves. But in adult, the muscle layers are not continuous because of the fibrous skeleton. If you remember, because of the fibrous skeleton of the heart, the muscles of the atrium and the muscles of the ventricles are not continuous. এটা তোমাদের মনে আছে. But in embryo and fetus, they are continuous. And there is a peristaltic wave, like your gut tube that begins in the sinus venosa. So this wave start from here. This is the central part of the sinus venosus, one horn and another horn. So this peristaltic wave start from the sinus venosus. This is our sinoatrial orifice, and this is sinoatrial valve. Remember, SA orifice or SA valve, sinoatrial. So here, this comes from here. This myogenic contraction start here. এখান থেকে এখানে like this. So the muscle layer, they are continuous. By the end of 4th week, coordinated contraction of the heart result in unidirectional flow. Just I have told you. Blood enters the sinus venosus from common cardinal veins, umbilical veins, and vitelline veins. I have told you. This is another figure, dorsal aspect of the heart. Dorsal view of the heart, 26 days, illustrating the horns of the sinus venosus and dorsal location of the primordial atrium. So here, the blue color is the venous part. কি হলো venous part এ, this is the central region of the sinus venosus, এই পুরাটা central region, and this is the sinoatrial orifice. এখান থেকে this is the primordial common atrium, এই পুরাটা primordial common atrium. Truncus arterius এখানে, bulbus cortis ওখানে, ventricle is over there, দেখতে পাচ্ছি না, we are not seeing here. So this is the central part of the sinus venosus, আর এটা হচ্ছে right horn of sinus venosus, and this one is the left horn. Look here, এই জায়গাটা আর এই জায়গাটা. So right horn of sinus venosus, left horn of sinus venosus, and sinus venosus will receive the cardinal vein, the umbilical vein, and the vitelline vein here and here. Right anterior cardinal vein, right posterior cardinal vein, right umbilical vein, right vitelline vein, left vitelline vein, left umbilical vein, left posterior cardinal vein, left anterior cardinal vein, left common cardinal vein. So these are the veins open into this is the left horn, This is the right horn, and this is the central part of the sinus venosus. This is sinuatrial orifice, and this is our common atrium. We are seeing the heart from back. And blood pass from the sinus venosus enter the primordial atrium. Flow from it is controlled by sinuatrial valve. And then from the primordial atrium, the blood then passes through the atrioventricular canal into the primordial ventricle. So blood from the sinus venosus to the sinuatrial valve come here, and from the atrioventricular canal to the ventricle. When the ventricle contracts, blood is pumped to the bulbus cordis and truncus arteriosus into the aortic sac. So this is about the aortic sac blood is distributed to the aortic arches in the pharyngeal arches. To the aortic arches, pharyngeal arches derivatives are supplied. So this is about the arterial end. So this is about the end. Now look at this picture, and this is important. So blood flow and embryological phase. Blood flow and embryological phase. So let us see from here. Let us see from here, and then we will talk about the derivatives. So here, look, solid arrows shows you the circulation, and dotted arrows, arrows show the embryological derivatives. So now, this is the sinus venosus. So blood, sinus venosus, ekhane. They receive blood from umbilical vein, vitelline vein, common cardinal vein, from both sides. So they receive the venous blood. So the venous blood enter into the atrium. Ekan theke venous blood goes to the atrium, and from the atrium, so ekan theke from the sinus venosus to the sinuatrial orifice to the atrium, from the atrium to the atrioventricular orifice to the ventricle, from the ventricle to the bulbus cordis, and from the bulbus cordis to the truncus arteriosus, and from the truncus arteriosus to the aortic sac, and then aortic arches. Aortic sac, and these are the aortic arches. And regarding the derivatives, the dotted line, the sinus venosus. The sinus venosus, it has a central part and left horn and right horn. So the right horn of the sinus venosus will give rise to, this will be incorporated into the future right atrium. We will see later on. So this right horn of the sinus venosus will become sinus venerum, which give rise to the smooth part of the smooth walled part of the right atrium. Left horn give rise to coronary sinus, which is the main vein of the heart. The atrium will give rise to right and left atrium. Ventricle will give rise to right and left ventricle. The bulbus cordis will give rise to truncus arteriosus and conus cordis. The conus cordis will become, one part of the conus cordis will become the aortic vestibule, and the other part will become, here they haven't written here, will become the infundibulum. And the truncus arteriosus will give rise to the aorta and the pulmonary trunk. And if you want to see about the sinus venosus, I will go to the previous picture, and if you can write it from here. Abar jodi boli, sinus venosus will receive venous blood from umbilical vein, vitelline vein, and common cardinal vein. To the sinuatrial orifice, it will go to the common atrium. From the common atrium to the atrioventricular orifice into the common ventricle. From the common ventricle to the bulbus cordis, and then to the truncus arteriosus, then aortic sac and aortic arches. And these are the derivatives. And about the sinus venosus, the right horn and the left horn. So let us go to the figure and I'll finish it today. Regarding this sinus venosus, it has a left horn and right horn. So this is the back of the heart. We are seeing the back of the heart. So this left horn will become the coronary sinus. Ekhane coronary sinus to have ekhane here. And the right horn will be absorbed into the posterior part of the future right atrium. এটা হচ্ছে common atrium. এই যে this one, right? না এটা ventricle. এখানে this part common atrium. এটুকু common atrium or primordial atrium. They will divide into right and left part later on. পরে এটা ভাগ হবে এদিকে right and এদিকে left. So this right horn of the sinus venosus will be absorbed into the posterior part of the future right atrium. And আমরা এটাকে বলি sinus venerum. And it will give rise to the posterior smooth-walled part of the right atrium. ঠিক আছে? So sinus venosus কই গেল? হ্যাঁ, এটা তো একটা central part. ঠিক আছে? Left horn will become the coronary sinus. Right horn of the sinus venosus will be absorbed into the posterior part of the future right atrium and will be known as the sinus venerum, which is nothing but the posterior smooth-walled part of the right atrium. So this is this much today. Next class regarding the CVS about the partitioning of the heart. Partitioning of the heart. So this is the end of this lecture. Thank you.
Assalamualaikum, ma'am.
Thank you.
Welcome, ma'am. Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am.
Assalamu alaikum.
Ma'am.